Angela Matthews stepped into the small courthouse with a quiet confidence, her heels clicking against the cold marble floors. It was just another routine hearing, or so it seemed. She had received a ticket for a minor traffic infraction earlier that week. Nothing serious, just a mistake made during her busy commute. Angela wasn't one to shy away from responsibility, but today something felt off. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, though no one in the room knew who she was. As she approached the bench, Judge Richard Thompson, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern expression, glanced up from his papers. He had seen countless people in his courtroom over the years, most of them blending together in the sea of minor offenses that filled his docket. Angela didn't stand out. At least, not in the way most people did. She wasn't particularly flashy in appearance. Her dark hair was neatly styled, and her business attire spoke more of professionalism than anything else. But something about her demeanor caught his attention, though he couldn't put his finger on it. "Ms. Matthews," Judge Thompson called, his voice cutting through the low hum of the courtroom. Angela stood tall and nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge peered at her for a moment, eyes scanning her face. He couldn't help but notice how composed she was. There was an air of calmness to her, an almost too perfect level of control, which he quickly dismissed as a sign of arrogance. After all, people who walked into his courtroom usually carried a sense of entitlement, unwilling to face the consequences of their actions. "You were cited for failure to yield to an emergency vehicle," Judge Thompson began, flipping through the paperwork. "Do you contest the violation?" "No, Your Honor," Angela responded, her voice steady, but not without a hint of firmness. "I don't contest the violation, but I would like to explain the circumstances." The judge barely glanced up, his attention focused more on the paperwork than on her words. "There's no need for a lengthy explanation," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "This is a standard infraction, and I don't see why you would be exempt from the fine." Angela opened her mouth to speak, but the judge cut her off before she could finish. "I'm going to issue a fine of $150. Court adjourned," he said abruptly, slamming his gavel down. Angela stood in silence for a moment, absorbing the impact of the decision. She had expected a fine, but there was something about the way the judge had dismissed her so easily that stung. It wasn't the money. It was the assumption that she was just another person who would bend under the weight of the system's indifference. As she turned to leave, Angela's expression remained unchanged. She walked out of the courtroom, but in her mind, a feeling of injustice began to simmer. She hadn't anticipated the unfairness, but she had also never backed down from a challenge. Today, the game had just begun. Angela stepped out of the courtroom with a quiet resolve, though her pulse quickened slightly as the door swung shut behind her. The sound of her footsteps echoed down the hallway, each click against the floor reinforcing the weight of the moment. The fine was small in the grand scheme of things, but the dismissive way it had been imposed left a sour taste in her mouth. She had hoped for a fair hearing, a chance to explain herself, but instead, she was treated as just another person in the crowd, her voice drowned out by assumptions. The courtroom had been small and cramped, and the atmosphere heavy with the unspoken judgments of those within it. Angela's calmness had not been interpreted as the strength it was, but rather as an indication that she was unbothered by the system. Judge Thompson, in particular, seemed to have made up his mind before she even spoke. It was a subtle form of disrespect, one that she had encountered before, but never quite like this. His quickness to issue the fine, without listening to her full explanation, gnawed at her. But Angela wasn't someone who would let this slide. While many would have simply accepted the fine and moved on, she wasn't just any ordinary citizen. She knew how to navigate systems that underestimated people like her, how to stand firm in the face of misjudgment and turn it into something bigger. She didn't immediately react in the courtroom, but inside, she was already making her mental notes, preparing herself for what was to come. Angela was no stranger to adversity. Over the years, her work had taken her into some of the most high-stakes situations imaginable. She had dealt with national security threats, studied extremist organizations, and even helped shape policies that kept the country safe. In a way, the judge's dismissal reminded her of the countless times she had been underestimated throughout her career. People often judged her by the surface: her age, her race, her gender. But they never looked deeper, never understood the vast experience and expertise she carried. It was a familiar frustration, one that she had learned to navigate in silence, but it was also the fuel that kept her moving forward. Angela's thoughts shifted briefly as she walked past the courthouse steps and into the parking lot, but she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end of the story. She wouldn't let the judge's casual judgment define her. She had seen far worse. This was just another challenge, another moment where she could take control of the narrative. As she started her car and drove off, the feeling of injustice lingered, but so did the calm certainty that she could, and would, make things right. The morning after the court hearing, Judge Richard Thompson sat at his desk, reviewing the mountain of paperwork that had piled up on him over the last few days. The courtroom was quiet, a typical day filled with minor infractions and routine cases. Yet something about Angela Matthews kept drifting back into his thoughts. There was a certain professionalism about her, a calmness in the way she had presented herself. It was clear she had no intention of being dismissed, but at the time, he had written it off as mere defiance. He shook his head, trying to focus. His mind kept returning to her final words, the ones that lingered after the gavel fell. She hadn't protested the fine. No, she had simply accepted it with a quiet dignity, an acceptance that felt, somehow, too easy. She had let him do what he thought was his duty without a fight, but it was her cool composure that left him feeling unsettled. There was something in that exchange, something about Angela Matthews, that felt out of place, but he couldn't put his finger on it. His thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his office phone. He answered, his voice automatically neutral. Judge Thompson speaking. "Judge, I hope I'm not disturbing you," came the voice on the other end. It was his colleague, Peter Carmichael, a fellow judge who worked in a larger jurisdiction. "I was just reviewing some federal case files and came across something that might interest you." Judge Thompson frowned, puzzled. "Go ahead, Peter." "There's a name I'm sure you've heard, Angela Matthews. The woman you fined yesterday in your court." Peter continued, his tone shifting to one of curiosity. "Do you know who she is?" Thompson's brow furrowed. "She was in for a traffic violation, nothing more." Peter paused, as if processing the information. "That's what I thought too. But it turns out Angela Matthews isn't just some average citizen. She's actually a leading counterterrorism expert, working closely with federal agencies, including the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI. She's one of the top experts in national security strategy." The words hit Thompson like a cold slap. His mind raced as he tried to piece it all together. The woman he had just fined was a national security expert. His mind quickly recalled the way he had dismissed her in court, barely paying attention as she stood there, offering only the briefest defense before the fine was issued. "You're telling me she's an expert?" Thompson asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as disbelief settled in. "I had no idea." Peter chuckled softly on the other end. "Yeah, well, not everyone's name gets plastered across headlines. She prefers to stay out of the public eye, working behind the scenes to keep the country safe. I just thought you should know." The weight of the revelation hung in the air. Judge Thompson's thoughts spiraled, each one filled with regret. He had done it again. He had assumed, and in doing so, had disrespected someone who deserved far more than just a passing glance. After the phone call ended, Judge Thompson sat still, his mind racing. The steady hum of the courthouse around him seemed to blur as the reality of the situation sank in. Angela Matthews, the woman he had just fined for a minor traffic violation, was no ordinary person. She was a highly respected expert in counterterrorism, someone who had worked with federal agencies to safeguard national security. He had read about high-profile figures in this field, but never in a million years had he imagined one would walk through his courtroom, facing a trivial fine. The weight of his snap judgment settled heavily on him. He had barely given Angela a second glance, hadn't bothered to look deeper than the surface. He had seen a woman, calm but assertive, and assumed she was just another person trying to avoid responsibility. He hadn't even taken a moment to consider the possibility that she might be someone extraordinary. His thoughts drifted back to the courtroom, where Angela had stood in front of him, her composed demeanor hiding a wealth of knowledge and expertise. He could almost picture her face again, the way she had held herself with quiet dignity, not out of arrogance, but out of a calm understanding. He had dismissed her too easily. It had been a routine case for him, and perhaps in that casualness, he had allowed his biases to creep in. Judge Thompson hadn't questioned the assumption that Angela, like so many others, might be unprepared or unaware of the system's workings. But now, with the new information about her background, he couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that his behavior had been more than just a mistake. It had been a profound failure of judgment. In the days that followed, Judge Thompson couldn't stop thinking about Angela. His usual confidence in his decisions began to waver. He found himself going over the details of her case, replaying her every word in his mind, wondering if she had been trying to convey something more to him that he had missed. Her calmness, her lack of protest, it wasn't weakness. It was control, something he now understood. He took the time to look into Angela's professional life. What he discovered only deepened his discomfort. She had advised on counterterrorism strategies, led security programs, and worked on some of the most critical issues facing the country. She had risked her life, studying complex international threats and helping to protect millions of Americans. Yet here she was, standing in front of him in a courtroom, treated like any other person with a minor infraction. Judge Thompson had made an error, one that went beyond just a courtroom decision. His assumptions, his lack of empathy, had been a reflection of a system that often failed to see the full picture. He felt a sense of guilt he hadn't experienced before. The realization stung, but it also brought a shift within him, a need to make things right. As Judge Thompson wrestled with his growing sense of regret, he dug deeper into Angela Matthews' career. It didn't take long for him to realize just how extraordinary she truly was. What had seemed like a routine courtroom encounter had turned into a moment of personal reckoning for the judge. Angela's name had come up in discussions of national security and counterterrorism for years, though her work was largely behind the scenes. In her line of work, anonymity was as much a tool as expertise. Angela Matthews had been working in the field of national security for over a decade, and her expertise was unrivaled. She had helped develop strategic counterterrorism policies that were now being implemented by federal agencies. Her ability to analyze threats and predict the movements of extremist organizations had saved countless lives. Yet the world knew little about her. Angela preferred to stay out of the public eye, focused instead on making a real difference, even if her name never made the headlines. Her work with the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI had been instrumental in shaping responses to both domestic and international threats. She had played a critical role in the development of counterterrorism strategies that had been used in high-stakes operations across the globe. Angela had worked with law enforcement agencies to assess potential risks and vulnerabilities within national infrastructure, guiding responses to security breaches, and even conducting training sessions to prepare local authorities for terrorist threats. Her expertise had earned her respect, not just within government circles, but among the experts she collaborated with internationally. Angela was often sought after for her insights into geopolitical situations, advising policymakers on security measures and counter-extremism initiatives. Her ability to think critically, to evaluate complex situations under immense pressure, made her a key player in the ever-evolving field of counterterrorism. Despite her impressive credentials, Angela rarely spoke about her work in public. She had always believed that her actions spoke louder than words, that her contributions were more impactful when kept out of the spotlight. Her quiet professionalism had always been at odds with the world's love of headlines and sensationalism, but that suited her just fine. Angela believed that real change was not made by seeking recognition, but by creating lasting, tangible effects on the ground. And yet, despite her crucial role in national security, Angela Matthews found herself sitting in Judge Thompson's courtroom for something as trivial as a traffic violation. The incongruity of it all was not lost on her, but Angela had learned long ago how to move through life with grace, understanding that not everyone would see her for what she truly was. As Judge Thompson learned more about her, the weight of his actions grew heavier. He had not just fined a woman for a minor infraction. He had underestimated someone who had dedicated her life to keeping the country safe. The days following his discovery felt like a blur for Judge Thompson. He found himself at the courthouse earlier than usual, staying late, revisiting old cases and the decisions he had made over the years. But no matter how hard he tried to focus on anything else, his mind kept drifting back to Angela Matthews. He couldn't shake the discomfort that had settled in his chest, nor could he ignore the guilt that gnawed at him every time he thought about the way he had treated her. He knew he had to make things right, but he wasn't sure how. How could he apologize for something as inconsequential as a courtroom decision, when the weight of it extended so much deeper? His assumptions had been based not just on Angela's appearance, but on everything he had believed about people like her. He had dismissed her as just another defendant, someone who, like so many others, might simply fade into the background of his busy courtroom. But Angela was not like the others. She was a woman who had dedicated her life to something far greater than the petty issues that filled his caseload. Judge Thompson wrestled with his own pride. How could he approach someone of Angela's stature, someone who had made such an impact in her field, and admit that he had been wrong? It felt awkward, even humiliating. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. If he truly wanted to make amends, he had to own his mistake. He couldn't let her walk away from this without knowing that he understood the gravity of his error. Finally, after days of careful reflection, Judge Thompson decided to reach out. He found Angela's contact information through a colleague in the federal system, and with a mixture of nervousness and determination, he wrote her an email. "Dear Ms. Matthews, I hope this message finds you well. I am writing to you today regarding your appearance in my courtroom earlier this week. I have spent a great deal of time reflecting on the way I handled your case, and I feel compelled to express my sincere regret for the way I treated you. Upon learning more about your background and the remarkable work you have done in the field of national security, I am deeply ashamed of my assumptions and the way I rushed to judgment. You are someone who has dedicated your life to keeping others safe, and yet I failed to give you the respect and consideration you deserve in my courtroom. I understand if you have little desire to engage with me further, but I wanted to offer a sincere apology. I hope you will allow me the opportunity to make things right. Sincerely, Judge Richard Thompson." The email was sent, and Judge Thompson sat back in his chair, his fingers lightly drumming on the desk as he waited. He had no idea how Angela would respond, if she would respond at all, but he felt a sense of relief in finally acknowledging his mistake. He had done all he could to correct the wrong, but now it was up to her. Judge Thompson didn't expect a quick response. He figured Angela Matthews, someone with an incredibly demanding job, might not have time for such a personal request. But to his surprise, just a few hours later, he received an email back. Her message was short, professional, but also gracious. "Dear Judge Thompson, thank you for your email and your thoughtful words. I appreciate your honesty and your willingness to reflect on the situation. I would be happy to meet with you in person. Please let me know a convenient time. Best regards, Angela Matthews." The reply was brief but polite. Angela had agreed to meet. It was the first step toward resolving what had initially seemed like a trivial misunderstanding. But for Judge Thompson, it felt much more significant than that. This was about acknowledging an error that went far beyond a courtroom ruling. It was about understanding the systems and biases that influenced his decisions, often without him realizing it. They agreed to meet the next afternoon at a small cafe not far from the courthouse. When Angela arrived, Judge Thompson recognized her immediately. She was even more poised in person, her posture straight, her expression calm. Yet there was an undercurrent of strength in her presence that he hadn't fully appreciated during their brief encounter in the courtroom. She didn't walk in with a sense of superiority, but there was something undeniably commanding about her. "Judge Thompson," Angela greeted him, extending her hand. Her handshake was firm, yet it didn't feel like a power move. It felt like a mutual acknowledgement of the situation at hand. "Ms. Matthews," he replied, offering a tentative smile. "Thank you for meeting with me. I know my actions were inexcusable, but I hope we can have a candid conversation about it." Angela took a seat across from him, her eyes steady but not unkind. "I was surprised to hear from you, but I believe it's important that people take responsibility for their actions," she said, her voice measured but sincere. "I didn't expect an apology, but I respect your decision to offer one." Thompson paused, looking at her with a deep sense of remorse. "I was quick to judge you in court, Ms. Matthews. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on it, and I realize how wrong I was. You have a remarkable career, and yet I treated you as though you were just another defendant. I failed to see beyond the surface, and that was a mistake I deeply regret." Angela nodded, listening intently, her expression thoughtful. "I understand how these things happen. People often don't see what's beneath the surface. But that's the problem, isn't it? We tend to judge based on what's visible, not on who people truly are." There was a moment of silence between them, and Judge Thompson could feel the weight of her words. He had come to this meeting hoping to explain himself, but in reality, Angela was the one doing most of the talking. Her words were a gentle challenge, a reminder of how easy it was for him, and so many others, to overlook the richness of someone's story, simply because it wasn't immediately visible. "Thank you," Thompson said quietly, after a long pause. "I've learned more from you in these few minutes than I did in all the time I've spent on the bench." The conversation continued, flowing between the two of them with an ease that surprised Judge Thompson. Angela spoke openly about her work, sharing the weight of the responsibilities she carried and the constant pressure of protecting national security. She described the long hours, the sacrifices, and the sense of duty that had driven her to a career few ever truly understood. But even as she spoke, there was no bitterness, no desire for recognition. She had found peace in doing the work, in knowing that her contributions made a real difference, even if the world never knew her name. For Judge Thompson, it was eye-opening. He had always considered himself a fair man, someone who approached each case with impartiality. But now he saw how often he, and the system he represented, relied on assumptions, on the stories people projected outward, and how easy it was to overlook the deeper truths beneath the surface. "I'm glad we had this chance to talk," Angela said, sipping her coffee and offering him a small smile. "I understand that mistakes happen. We all have our moments where we fail to see the full picture. What matters is that we learn from them." Judge Thompson felt a weight lift from his chest as he listened to Angela. There was no anger in her voice, no desire for retribution. Instead, there was understanding. She wasn't looking for an apology to make her feel better. She wanted a recognition of the broader problem, the way systems and people too often fail to see the worth in others because of preconceived notions. It wasn't just about him or the fine. It was about something much larger. "I've learned a great deal from this, Ms. Matthews," he admitted. "It's not just about seeing your credentials or your accomplishments. It's about truly seeing the person in front of you, and I failed at that. But I won't make that mistake again." Angela's gaze softened, and for the first time in their conversation, she reached across the table, her hand briefly resting on his. "The fact that you're willing to acknowledge it is a step in the right direction," she said. "It's easy to make assumptions, but the real challenge is changing the way we think, to push past those surface judgments." For the first time since the incident, Judge Thompson felt like he had learned something valuable. It wasn't just about courtrooms or laws. It was about empathy, about recognizing the humanity in every person who walked into his space, regardless of their status or background. He had taken a small step toward understanding, and he knew he wasn't done. There was still work to be done, both in his professional life and in his personal growth. As they parted ways that afternoon, Judge Thompson felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for days. Angela Matthews had not just shown him how wrong he had been, but had also given him the opportunity to be better, to see beyond the surface and look deeper at the people who crossed his path. And for that, he was profoundly grateful.